welcome to our event tonight. My name is Maurice Wallace. I am an associate professor in the Department of English at Rutgers, New Brunswick, and I am the director of the Gospel Materialities Working Group, an affiliate group of the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers. This is a commemorative event in a significant way, celebrating the 50th anniversary and enduring life of Anthony Heilbut's 1971 publication, The Gospel Sound, Good News and Bad Times. Tonight, Mr. Heilbut will join Professor Johari Jabir, an associate professor of Black Studies at University of Illinois, Chicago, for a public conversation about the Gospel Sound, both the book specifically, now in its 4th edition, and the form and aesthetic of the Gospel Sound generally. Tonight, we're fortunate to have not one, but 2 experts to discuss this work and practice of gospel with us. Professor Johari Jabir is a scholar, a contemplative, and sometime performer of Black sacred music and thought. Who among us who has ever undertaken any serious study of modern gospel has not encountered Anthony Heilbut's The Gospel Sound? This vital work, Jimmy Baldwin once called a beautiful book with love and precision, no pity, a little like a gospel song. With that then, I will, as we say in a certain tradition, introduce to some and present to others my friend Johari Jabir and my new friend Anthony Heilbut for their conversation about this pioneering work, The Gospel Sound, and about gospel music at large.
Tony, I'm wondering if you might start us off by reflecting on your first experience with gospel music.
You won't believe this, but I'm the child of German Jewish refugees, and I was always extremely social, very socially conscious. When I was 13 in the 9th grade, my social studies teacher at an open school afternoon pointed to me and asked me to defend the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I promise you, in McCarthy era Queens, nobody knew what the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was, but I did, and I said, Senator McCarthy calls them premature anti-fascists, but when was it premature to be anti-fascist? With that in mind, you can understand why when I was 14, I got my first job, summer job, working on a farm in Canton, North Carolina. And believe it or not, the first gospel church I went to was a white Pentecostal church. And because these things happened to me, my life is, as you will see, just a series of coincidences. Of course, there was a lady with a big black hat. She got happy, and of course, who would she fall out on? My arms. When I was in high school, I was a great fan of what was then called rock and roll, but I was a fan when Moondog, later known as Alan Freed, first colonized New York. And what was striking to me in that white Pentecostal church is that the white sanctified people were clapping correctly. When I would go to the Brooklyn Paramount Theater, they clapped with feeling, but in all directions. But the white Pentecostals clapped the way they clapped 2 and 4. I had so advanced that when I was 16, graduated from high school and was entering college. How about these events? I got my first city job working for the Billy Graham Crusade at Madison Square Garden. And because I'm endlessly curious, I attended one of their events, and the guest artist was Dale Evans, the wife of Roy Rogers. And who else did she sing? Amazing Grace. And that summer, I also was hired by somebody to do research on Ray Charles's first album, The Genius of Ray Charles. But the experience of my 16th summer, which is by far the richest, like a Proustian episode, you can milk it. I could drain it for years. Occurred. I tuned in the radio to listen to the Newport Jazz Festival, and I heard somebody who sounded like an extremely powerful female version of Little Richard. And then I heard two commentators. The woman who reminded me of Little Richard was Marion Williams, who was in fact Little Richard's inspiration. When I met him in 1961 with her, he said he'd been singing like her for years, and he got everything from her, even his pompadour, but his phrasing, his syncopation. Mahalia Jackson was talking to Jackie Robinson, and that just begins to unlock this. And then after that, I started going to the Apollo Theater 3 or 4 times a week, and I attended the first New York appearance of the Staples Singers. 3 months after, that was January 1958. 3 months later, I attended Aretha Franklin's first concert in New York City. So I was exposed to a great deal very, very early. I also started going to the Hotel Cecil in Harlem, which was sort of the poor man's Hotel Teresa. And there I would get to know many of the singers. Some of the singers I would get to know for 50, 60 years. My oldest friend is Brother Joseph Jojo Wallace. He was the guitarist and manager of a quartet called the Sensational Nightingales, whose lead singer, Julius Cheeks, was the inspiration of Wilson Pickett. Every year, he calls me or I call him, and we talk about the past. Every year he says to me the same thing: boy, you have a photostatic reminiscence, which is, next to Jimmy Baldwin's words, almost my favorite.
I wonder if you might talk about, in the introduction to your book, you emphasize the folk artistic nature of gospel. Can you talk a bit about why the folk nature of gospel seemed to really move you?
Almost my favorite sound is the moan. And I think it's maybe the great American sound, because I don't find it in any other continent. So much of evangelical worship derives from England or Scotland. In the 18th century, people were acting quite, well, the term holy rollers is supposedly dating from the 1840s in Kentucky, but all the descriptions of revivals in England in the 18th century sound very much like what we know today. And people have been dancing in all cultures, but that particular sound is really, I think, indigenous to this continent. And my father was a very devout Jew, and whenever I would play, if truth be told, my favorite kind of gospel is the long, slow, long meter hymns, filled with melisma and slurs and moans. And my daddy would say, but they all sound like husbands, cantors. What I've been able to do now, what I regret not doing in the gospel sound, is not treating the very early history. The first chapter of the new book is going to be called The Moan, the Hoop, and the Move. And those are all 3 forms of performance that, as far as I can tell, date very much back to the 19th century.
Mm.
And this, even now, you will hear contemporary singers, Marvin Sapp or Kim Burrell, employ those forms.
Mhm.
I am, as is pretty well known, not at all a fan of post-1960, but post-1970 gospel. But those devices are permanent. They're etched in the culture.
Can you say, Tony, what was your first impression when you heard Dr. Watts singing?
Thrilled. Dr. Watts and all of that, that's 18, that's the poetry of, or that's the working class poetry of the late 18th, early 19th century. I'm sure you're familiar with maybe the most famous moan ever recorded is Blind Willie Johnson's "Dark Was the Night and Cold the Ground."
Mhm.
Well, I'm rather proud that it's flying in space. Well, Anne Druyan, the wife of the great scientist Carl Sagan, called me a few years ago. She said she had purchased my second album for John Hammond, The Gospel Sound Volume 2, 1972. And Dark Was the Night was on it. She loved it so much, she gave it to her husband, and that's why it's in space. So now, if people think of an American sound, they will think of Blind Willie's moaning that English hymn. The first gospel song I ever composed was from Marion Williams. It was called Bad News, Bad Times. And it's totally political, but it's got a 16-bar gospel blues melody. That came out in 1972. One of the thrills of my life was learning that in the mid-70s, in South Africa, under apartheid, an integrated band recorded Bad News, Bad Times. And that song was in a French movie a year ago. That means almost 50 years, almost as long as Good News and Bad Times, Bad News, Bad Times. Oh, absolutely. And by the way, since I hope this isn't too recondite, but Good News and Bad Times was my title. My editor, Michael Corder, had previously published a very successful book about country and Western music called The Nashville Sound. So he came up with the gospel sound, and Good News and Bad Times was mine, but the gospel sound was his.
Can you talk a bit about how you heard the blues resonant in the gospel that was being pioneered when you met these folks?
Well, in fact, I got a job out of that because I think I mentioned earlier that on the 16th summer, I did research in Ray Charles's first album. And so I discovered all of these wonderful blues pianists, Montana Taylor, people like that. Ray Charles had not heard any of them, but of course, the connections between blues and gospel are vivid to me. And as you can tell, if my favorite songs of those are things like The Day Is Past and Gone or Poor Pilgrim of Sorrow, I would love blues. And in fact, I hope this isn't too distant, but in the new book, I'm among the many things I didn't treat in the past were the role of the gospel woman. And when I was putting some stuff together, I realized there's hardly any analysis of the blues woman, possibly because so many white blues fans are Eric Clapton. But so I think a great deal about the blues gospel connection. And at times, when I would produce my own records, I would come up with lyrics to a 12-bar gospel lyrics to a 12-bar blues. And I composed one for Marion Williams called Sometimes I Ring Up Heaven, and it did okay. But a few years ago, Nina Hagen, who is sort of the Madonna of Central Europe, discovered it and recorded it. And it became sort of an international hit. So for me, the connection between gospel and blues is something I think about when I think about gospel.
Mm-hmm. You wrote in the section about Mahalia Jackson, you described her as a student or a daughter, you say, of Bessie Smith. Can you say a bit more about Bessie Smith's imprint or influence on Mahalia's singing?
Mahalia loved Bessie Smith, and according to Alex Bradford, for her birthday every year, she would have members of the Willie Webb Singers. Willie Webb was one of the original Martin singers. Alex Bradford was an early member of the Webb Singers, as was Albertina Walker, and another woman who's not well known, but a great legend named Ozella Weber. And each year, to satisfy Haley, that was her nickname, they would all sing a Bessie Smith blues. And apparently her favorite was, "You've been a good old wagon, but you done broke down." And so the impression is, and Mahalia's one of her best friends was J. Robert Bradley. And she called Bradley the greatest gospel singer. I became very friendly with him years later. And one time he asked me to play him Bessie Smith. Now, since he was born in 1919 in Memphis, I thought he would have heard Bessie Smith, but I played it from over the phone.
Do you have anything to say about the similarities in terms of sound? You know, both Dorothy Lovecoats and Professor Alex Bradford had a really hard driving gospel sound. Do you think it was at all reflective of the kind of Alabama communist politics there, the factories, you know, pig iron factories? Do you see any connection between how they sounded and the kind of Black political atmosphere in Alabama?
I wish I could say yes, but in 1961, Alex was offered a song called Brown Baby by Oscar Brown Jr. And Mahalia herself had recorded it. But Alex declined it and said, "It sounds like a communist song." And you're absolutely right to connect the communists and Alabama, because the communists played a huge role in delivering the Scottsboro Boys.
Yeah.
But what I learned from John Hammond, who had been active in all of the stuff in the 1930s, is that when the left went to the South, some of the biggest enemies they met, the people the least cooperative, were Black preachers. And we can understand many reasons why that would be the case. So, and one time after Dr. King's assassination, Alex said that he was a bit angry, and if a white guy had said something nasty, he would have responded. But he always tended to duck that. Dorothy Lovecoats was very political. To me, it's forgetting everything else about the harmonic singing. The fact is that there were three politically committed members, Evelyn, Odessa, and Dorothy. Is thrilling, because I was so hungry for political discussions, some sort of political commentary, because even by 1957, there was enough talk about these matters, and almost nobody alluded to any of these questions.
I want to go to James Baldwin and his response that you documented on your webpage. And I'm curious, Tony, how or whether or not the book changed your perspective on Black culture. How did it change you? What did you learn from writing the book?
Well, the gospel sound was largely stuff I knew, and which is one reason it was the book I wrote the quickest. And but I've learned a great deal since, and I've had to come to consider and reconsider many, many issues. But that is sort of my nature. And preparing my history, for your questions, I should have mentioned this earlier. I was a very early music lover, and like the children of many refugees, I took piano lessons. And after my mother's death, I found some notes from my piano teacher. She came from a very distinguished background. Her uncle was the great pianist Arthur Schnabel. And anyway, she wrote, Anthony has a very good ear. He loves rhythm, but he will not follow the score. So, and I said that, and I said, boy, you've never changed. And I had the same feeling a couple of years ago when I read the biography of Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I was scheduled to produce her comeback album the day she died. And that's one of the saddest days of my life. They discovered on her bed only one piece of paper. It was the list of songs that I had sent her, of the songs that we had rehearsed and planned to record. And several of the titles have been scrapped, have been crossed out and replaced. And once again, I said, you never changed. So I'm always, if I really care about something, I'm always reconsidering and constantly learning new stuff. I am astonished how much I have learned in the last couple of years about both the history of women in gospel and the queer history of gospel, which I used to date to people like Alex Bradford, but now, I'm prepared to date to the 1890s. So there's always more stuff for one to learn.
I have sort of two final questions I'd like for you to think about out loud. One is, what are your thoughts about the state of gospel today? And if you might articulate some of your thoughts about the queer history of gospel.
Maybe they're connected.
I would think so too. Yeah.
And I will tell you, I used to say to Jimmy, and we spent so much time together because when he contacted me, and essentially he was picking my brain for the novel he was writing just above my head. He was living on 71st Street. He bought a home for his mother and sister Gloria, and I was living in 69. So he never came to my house. I lived 2 flights up, and he was quite frail, but I visited him many, many times. And our conversation was quite frank. And I told him how often I had despaired about a right-wing turn in gospel, which maybe was there always. And he would say to me, baby, he always called you baby, it's the best and worst of us. And why I love that, I wrote a book about Thomas Mann. And right after World War II, 1945, Mann wrote something about Germany, and he said, good Germany is bad Germany. Bad Germany is good Germany. I know it because I had both of them in me. And his brother Heinrich, who was a very great novelist himself, wrote back to Thomas and said, that's worth a whole career that you can come up with that. And so the gospel, what can I say? At this moment, all the big names in gospel that I'm aware of, Caesar, Winans, McClurkin, Clark, Sheard, et cetera, Burrell, are people who have gone out of their way to make really very brutal homophobic comments, something that quite horrified me in 2004. I really wish to say, because it's my testimony, that Donald Trump is the worst president in American history. But until the last few years, I would have given that to George W. Bush, mostly for the war in Iraq. In 2004, when Bush ran for re-election, the first two Black celebrities to endorse him were Bishop Marvin Winans and his Minister of Music, Donnie McClurkin. And their reason was his opposition to same-sex marriage. In addition, we saw the documentary, The Black Church. You can even see me in it for 8 seconds talking about the Mississippi Hoop. But I missed and really wish they had dealt with the fact that the Black Church covers much more than the United States, and that Black Pentecostal missionaries, Black as well as white, have truly colonized the West Indies and Africa. Africa is now the most Pentecostal continent in the world. And the results have been just abominable, murderous. And on several occasions, I have sent money to some organization that is devoted to protecting young people who flee some of those countries, Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana. And when the other travelers discover that this young person is queer, they will want to kill the person. Now, this is very much a product of the Black Church. On the other hand, and this is the paradox with which I guess I'll be ending my book, with all that terrible stuff, we have Lil Nas X, who you could, in some ways you could see as a great nephew of Alex Bradford. And Lil Nas X says that in one interview, he said, whatever he's doing for some little guy, some little boy down the road, which I found so touching, because essentially he was saying that he was talking to all the kids bullied and brutalized. And we know that there are so many great young writers, most of them queer. I call them Jimmy Baldwin's children. So maybe it was always this conflicted. But yeah, if I think about the first, I'm very upset. But then I can look at the work of Byron Washington or Marlon James.
Well, Tony, do you see any good news for today's bad times in gospel?
Well, oh, by the way, let me add something. You know, since I will sound so much like the old moldy fake fellow who only likes the music of his youth. Modern gospel was very good to me for for 30 years. I taught college until my mid-30s, and but for 30 years, I compiled albums, mostly of Black, occasionally a white gospel. My biggest hit actually was an opera anthology, but I compiled such albums for 30 years. And of course, I included all the modern hits because I was hired to sell records. So, and in terms of the quality or the musicianship of more recent gospel, I could show you all the things that are impressive, but the truth is, it's left me cold for a very long time. I don't know whether that's an aesthetic response or a cultural response, but in terms of there are still tremendous voices, but then I tell myself they're tremendous voices, but But then in every college, there's a music, or high school, there's a musical theater with kids with great voices. I'm afraid that's not a great answer.
I'm wondering, with your wealth of experience, is there any physical object or thing about your life with these artists on the road, in the studio, any particular object that you think is a kind of prism that shows us something about gospel and its rich culture?
You want to laugh, but what comes to mind immediately, the pocketbook. The pocketbook. And I know Professor Jabiris is working on James Cleveland, and James would frequently tell the people in the audience who were getting very impassioned. He said, "Now hold on to your pocketbook, because everyone ain't saved." And in other words, and what has always impressed me is how tightly those women have grip to their pocketbooks. And I even noticed that Aretha, who was certainly better off than all the gospel singers, was famous for holding onto her pocketbook as well. And since gospel is such a Protestant music, and since American Protestantism is so much out of the Martin Luther emphasis on capital, on earning, I would see the pocketbook as an emblem. And the one theme that I have found constant in gospel recordings, from the sermons in the early 20s to what you might hear today, is the emphasis on money. You're not going. There'll be food on your roof over your head, food on the table, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, of course, and this was central long before what they call prosperity gospel.
A lot of narratives that people tell about a lot of genres are these narratives of, it was great until the music industry got a hold of it, or until, it became about marketing, or it became about, monetization of the craft. Is that, do you think that, you've identified the pocketbook or money as always having been something that was part of the considerations as gospel was, or as, Black Protestantism or Pentecostalism? Is there any, is that a narrative that you think around marketing and the business of records, the business of music? Is that a narrative that doesn't fit here, or that we need to think differently about?
I can't blame the A&R men. And I knew most of them, and I got along with them. Interesting, you will appreciate this, Johari. I was told many years ago that a singer named Jesse Dixon told me that the fellows from Savoy Records, Freddie Mendelssohn and Lawrence Roberts, had warned him off me because I was a communist. And most of the people involved, black or white, were right-wing, as small businessmen often are. But I never had a sense they were trying to commercialize the music. All of them were quite sophisticated in knowing that this was a specific market and they were targeting it. For example, in New York City, Apollo Records, the label for which Mahalia made her first post-war records, was a label that targeted many different groups. They put out Hawaiian music, they put out Irish music, they put out Yiddish music. And they understood, small as they were, then that you didn't mess with what the people wanted. All the changes that have occurred, I think, were generated by the singers. Andre Crouch once told Jesse Dixon, or at least Jesse told me this, that his three inspirations were Stevie Wonder, the Beatles, and Billy Graham. And Andre Crouch was famous for having these open altar calls, which, by the way, did not occur when I was young. This emphasis on getting saved and converted or anything else just wasn't there. I think until well into the 70s, maybe 80s, and Crouch may have been one major reason. He said Stevie Wonder, and one time, because I'm not a fan of, as you can see, of contemporary gospel, I sometimes describe the more recent style as the Detroit disease and the gospel gargle. The Detroit disease because the singers are so clearly trying to imitate Stevie Wonder. Now, no A&R man, no executives told the singers to do this. The singers came up with this on their own. I would, as you can sort of guess, I'd love to blame something on right-wing capitalists, but I really can't here.
You're laughing, Dr. Jabiris. Any take on that question from your angle?
I'm actually laughing at the sort of uncanny nature, and of course, Tony is a comrade, and but Professor Wallace put in the general chat, I'm working on this book about Reverend James Cleveland, and so I of course spent some time looking into the church he grew up in, which was Pilgrim Baptist Church.
Mr. Dorsey's church.
Yes, Mr. Dorsey's church. Yes. So one of the things that every time I read this piece of research, the man who would have been Cleveland's pastor, Reverend Junius Caesar Austin, who was a very esteemed Black clergy in the National Baptist Convention. Gardner Taylor preached his funeral. He was a Garveyite, and he holds a rally in around 1929 for the Pullman Porters. And he says, some of these people are accusing me of being a communist. And he says, if being a communist means, fighting for equality, and he has a whole speaking bullet points thing, he says, then, I'm just a communist until I die. And then he gives another speech, actually published sermon in and around 1937, where he describes capitalism as a relic from 1776. And I guess what really strikes me is that Tony, his radical rhetoric is being manifested in the gospel sound to me. Baldwin said, he says, Black people aren't singing the gospel. And then he says, if you know what I mean. So, Baldwin's saying that Black people are not really making music out of colonial Christianity, that they've tapped into something else about the gospel. And so this really radical preaching that Austin is doing is being manifested in the music. And I think it just strikes me at, the sort of conundrum of that even academic categories can't quite, comprehend that, but it makes perfect sense, right? Religion, it's sense making to these Black working class folk, which is why I asked Tony about what's happening in Alabama, right? That Dorothy Lovecoat says in the 60s, she talks about, enemies throwing rocks and hiding their hands. That's exactly what happened at demonstrations and marches. So those are the kinds of surprises that I'm always.
But in truth, Dot was not thinking about that. And something, here's something that I had many discussions with Jimmy about this. Baldwin is the only one I've read, who celebrated the church was not sentimental. And he said that one thing that characterized the church as he experienced was not bonhomie or friendship, but severe suspicion. And he noted that and I've seen this hundreds, thousands of times, that gospel singers will not look at each other in conversation, and not too much when they're singing. And frequently when they will look at each other, it's more as a challenge than a sign of friendship. So one time I joked with him, in the gospel sound, I wrote that I thought the quintessential gospel line was from Amazing Grace: through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. But I said to Jimmy, when I consider the extreme competitiveness, the deep suspicion, I think the quintessential line is, I'm going to tell God how you treat me. And he's a baby, only you, the way you would talk. And in other words, I don't think there's any area of the experience that isn't saturated with these issues. There is no safe place.
One of the questions in the chat is for you to tell us this from Dr. Wallace, to have you tell us about the new book.
I've titled it The Gospel Moment. And that's, but as I've said earlier, and I went to, you saw considerably, I'm always shifting. And the gospel moment would be a pun. Gospel moment being whether like me, you prefer Golden Age gospel or not, you will have to admit it was the most influential. You know, everyone knows Little Richard and Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, Sam Cooke, Al Green, these people, and I don't know if any of the great gospel stars of recent years have made much of an impression. So I'm thinking of the moment being when gospel influenced the world, but the moment will be something else too. And that is, and I didn't, as I said, I really took years to understand this. But when I came into gospel, it was the only, can I underline that, only popular music that was totally dominated by strong women and gay men. I have not found that in any other culture. And I won't mention names because, although of course we know James Cleveland's name because he died of AIDS, but because what's not at all an embarrassment to us is still considered an embarrassment. But trust me, virtually all the major names were either gay or gay adjacent. In other words, singers who might have a gay musician or a gay colleague.
Another question that we have in the chat is from Norma Lisa Thomas, and asks, what are your thoughts on the use of orchestra accompaniments in contemporary gospel, such as Richard Smallwood? How do you view this musical style of gospel?
What a coincidence, a couple of days ago on YouTube, I was viewing a big African Pentecostal service, I think in Nigeria. And there was an orchestra and you didn't see the singers, but it sounded like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I don't know, as somebody once said, the genie has escaped the bottle. I think that a brilliant arranger could probably do all kinds of things with modern gospel singers. There's no doubt that some of the musicians are terrific. I've worked with some of the best, most admired young musicians, the pianist Stephen Ford, the guitarist Jonathan DuBose Jr. And these are musicians who could play, who would be outstanding in any form of music. So my response is that if the arrangements are flattering to the singer, I'll go with it. Now, when I was, I wrote the gospel sound even earlier, I was, such a purist. But as somebody, wise person once told me, Tony, nothing is pure.
Can you say anything about what it has been like to pay attention to music and style, and and personality and all these other material constraints, but also to try to tell a story of spirit or identify spirit in your writing or in your thinking on the subject?
Well, I think a lot about that. I did a lot of record producing, and I offended some of my writer friends, when I told them that I'm just as proud of my music as of my books. When I would do my sessions, and it seems very paradoxical, given my lack of belief, I really wanted to have the people engaged. And I sort of liked it when we reached moments and when the spirit was pretty high, and they would look to me to more or less to come up with a song which would carry them over. What I've also found when I dealt with singers, what would get next to them most, what would get them, in the language, happy, would be stuff that was very intimate, something that really was a metaphor of their experiences, what I call the how I got over sensibility. What's interesting is that in the more recent post-Crouch arena, many of us, probably his song Through It All, which struck me anyway as a Hallmark greeting card, but that was kind of a testimony. But the kind of songs in which people could really express what they'd come out of. I don't know if there are too many of those songs still being composed. I may be wrong.
We have a question from Paul Wensky that you mentioned Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago. Paul says, before Dorsey became the director of the chorus and introduced his more bluesy style to the church, Edward Boatner was the choir director, and Boatner was one of the early preservers and champions of the spirituals. Mm-hmm. Michael Harris's Dorsey's biographer is critical of Boatner for what he said was, quote, Europeanizing African-American traditional music, and yet Boatner is remembered for introducing the beauty of the spirituals into contemporary gospel. In fact, Marian Anderson sang his arrangement, Paul points out. So the question here is, do you see any conflict between Boatner's arrangements of the spirituals in the 1920s for the National Baptist Convention and Dorsey's gospel blues?
Well, they were so very, very different. And some of the older churches, they would have a senior choir, which was devoted to more of those kind of arrangements. But almost all the gospel singers have told me that when they were raised, they were exposed to all kinds of music. The first gospel group, everyone agrees, is the Roberta Martin Singers. And Eugene Smith, one of the original members, told me that Miss Martin would have them have her boys, and these were boys whose voices hadn't changed yet, sing songs out of opera. This was in the 1930s. And I am, as I said, I love here is maybe a model of just how complicated and interconnected everything is. I mentioned Willa Mae Ford Smith, and I knew her very well. And I got her in the movie Say Amen Somebody, which is pretty much based on my book anyway. I visited Mother Smith shortly before her death. I visited the nursing home, and we had a good time. And then I sat down with her and I said, sweetheart, will you sing something for me? And she said she would. And while her daughter Jackie rolled her eyes, Willa Mae Ford Smith, born in Rolling Fork, Mississippi in 1904, the home of Muddy Waters. Willa Mae Ford Smith sang When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, and which would suggest that when she was very, very young. Mahalia, we all talk about Mahalia and Bessie Smith. The first records Heilbut were the records of this semi-classical soprano, Grace Moore. And, but I love that. I love that about America, that it's all open, it's all there. And the people didn't get what they deserved, but there's that kind of ambition.
Robin Story Dunn asks, do you see the more overt or pronounced homophobia in the Black church as a reaction to HIV/AIDS and the death of James Cleveland and the accompanying wave of deaths of people within churches? That's one question. I think that's more directed for Tony. But I want, before our time runs out, to also get out a second question here, which is directed for Professor Jabir as well. Colin Yeager asks to hear your take as well on the conservative capture of contemporary gospel, if that's what it is, taking some stock in sort of where things have gone.
Here's what I see in spending time with this stuff is I see a really violent rupture after the civil rights era of the 60s in terms of Black gospel being sustained by a very vibrant Black working class community. I see churches that have large populations of queer people and they're not anti-gay. I don't see that rhetoric. I think Cleveland even accommodates it in the workshop. He's back and forth with his board of directors who want him to speak to the population of queer people. And all Cleveland does is pretty much accommodate it. He never publicly says an anti-gay thing about gay people not being welcomed at the workshop. So I see a really violent rupture between the very strong Black working class tradition that gives birth to gospel. They are always bringing the blues with them. I see at Pilgrim, a church caught up in the contradictions of Black working class migrants and the respectability politics of large Black churches in Chicago. When Mr. Dorsey arrives in 1932 to establish that gospel chorus, there has been a continued singing of Dr. Watts that Black working class people have sustained since Pilgrim began as a house church, right? So they don't start like with a mega church, they start as little house churches. And so there's always, Tony's right, there's always this very complicated layer of what's happening. But I don't see what we describe as the Black church and this agenda that's homophobic. I don't see that until the 70s and 80s with word churches, with an emphasis on mega churches, and with a very public allegiance to American empire. The other thing I want to say is that if you look at people like Walter Hawkins, if you look at people like Thomas, what's the guy in Detroit, Tony? Thomas
Whitfield?
Thomas Whitfield, right. All these people are coming out of very strong working class traditions. And so for the 70s and 80s, you still have something reminiscent of the gospel sound that Tony writes about. But once those people die away and Cleveland dies in 91, not only is the sound very different, right, with sort of praise teams and things like that, but the very theology that you get coming from much of the church has no relationship to working class people. It's basically a sin to be poor.
I once joked that praise and worship killed Spirit-filled. And the other thing that I'm going to chastise myself for in my new book is I talked in the Gospel Sound. I think Gospel Sound is best known as a work of cultural integration, how Black gospel music would inspire other nationalities all over the world. But and if you want anyone to show how Aretha came out of the Davis sisters and the Ward singers, I'm a guy, how the quartets inspired some of the R&B crooners, I can do that. But I missed in the Gospel Sound the far more important integration of the last 50 years. And that was with PTL, 700, and more recently, that ghastly organization, Hillsong. And once those elements were introduced, whether they brought right-wing politics with them, I don't know. But what do we have? We have Paula White calling herself T.D. Jake's black daughter. You know, that is, I think, kind of an historical travesty. But in other words, where we are now is the result of many, many years. I have a memory, maybe this is the last thing because it was so gruesome. I saw a PTL something possibly in the early 70s, and they had a lot of pageants. In this case, they had a Civil War pageant and the Blues versus the Grays. And one Winan sibling, possibly Bibi, marched with the Blues, and the other, possibly Cece, marched with the Grays, as if they had no historical purchase of what was going on.
So I think it is so important that the sociology of the Black church has not yet caught up with the complexities of Black religious life. You know, I'm from St. Louis, where Tony spoke about Willie Mae Ford Smith. And I can tell you, as a kid born in '64, there were always churches where there were plenty of queer people. That is a part of our tradition as well. And so maybe the metaphor, when I teach my course on Black religion, the metaphor that I use for the church is that it's a tree with many branches. Mm-hmm. And there are people today like Yvette Flunder, right? There are people here in Chicago who have small ministries that are intentionally open for Black queer people. And I think that's a part of the tradition too. So I just want to lift that up so we don't continue to erase those people and render them silent. That has always been there. That tradition has always been there.
A man I first met when he was singing background for Alex Bradford, Carl Bean, started the first Black gay church, Unity Fellowship. Carl died a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
If there was one track that a student that has, you know, maybe a student who was born in some recent year, like 1999, that a student that a track that they should listen to as a way of opening themselves up to the power and beauty of all the historical thinking we're doing around gospel, what would that track be? What would that song or performance be for each of you?
Tony produced an anthology of Dorsey songs that was sung by people like Alex Bradford and Dolores Barrett Campbell. I would strongly suggest the track that Alex Bradford sings of the Dorsey song, If You See My Savior. It is the quintessential gospel blues example.
In an odd way, my mother left me standing out in the highway by the Angelic Gospel Singers and the Dixie Hummingbirds. The lead singer of the Angelics was Margaret Allison. Her nickname was Babe. And she repeats the line, she left me standing, mother left me standing. And she repeats the line at the end of the song. You can all hear it on YouTube. And I once said to my great friend, Herbert Picard, Pee-wee, the musician for the Gospel Harmonettes, Babe is by no means the greatest gospel singer, but you don't get any greater gospel singing than the way she sings that line. So if I had to pick one.
Well, this has been a wonderful afternoon into the evening to discuss. Thank you again for the scholarship and the thinking around this that has helped us really understand the gospel sound for 50 years, for half a century, and I'm sure will shape some of our conversations. You've given us many thoughts to help us think about how we continue to think about gospel and all of its social and political implications.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Yeah. La 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 la.